Good evening, and welcome to News of the World. It's Sunday, August 23. Tonight we drift slowly across 28 countries, from Austria to Colombia. There's nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Settle in and let the world turn. Austria has been watching its prices this summer, the way a gardener watches the sky, not with alarm, but with a kind of steady attention. Inflation there ticked up to 2.7% in July, a little higher than forecasters had expected. It's the sort of number that doesn't make anyone rush to the windows, but it does shape the texture of daily life. A coffee costs a few cents more. A weekly shop at the market settles a little heavier in the arms. For a country that sits at the crossroads of Central Europe, where Vienna's old cafes still serve cake on porcelain plates and the alpine villages count their seasons by snowfall and harvest, a number like this is a quiet companion. It tells you something about the pressure underneath ordinary things. Economists had thought the figure might come in lower. It didn't, and that small surprise is its own story, a reminder that recovery, wherever it is happening, rarely moves in a straight line. Austria's people are used to steadiness. They've lived through bigger shifts than this, and they'll live through this one too, adjusting quietly, the way people do when the cost of living bends upward without breaking anything. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment, a country keeping watch on its own numbers, neither frightened nor careless, just attentive. Somewhere in the alpine air this week, the evening is settling, and the price of bread is a small part of a much larger calm. Togo sits quietly on the Gulf of Guinea, a narrow strip of land between Ghana and Benin, and these days it is thinking about what climate change will ask of it. It is a small country, but small countries know that the weather does not pass them by. So Togo has been putting together something practical. It has unveiled 3 new tools designed to bring the private sector more fully into climate action, to make sure that businesses, not just government offices, have a hand in the work of adapting and responding. The details of those tools are still emerging, but the intention is clear enough. Togo wants to widen the circle of who is responsible for what comes next. In a country where most people live close to the land and the seasons, climate policy is not an abstract thing. It touches farming, fishing, the flow of rivers, the rhythm of ordinary life. And so inviting private enterprise into that conversation is, in its own quiet way, an act of preparation. Not a grand announcement, not a single dramatic gesture, just a country assembling what it thinks it will need. If you are still with me, picture a table somewhere in Lomé, the capital, where someone has laid out these new tools and is explaining how they might work. The room is warm, the conversation is serious, and outside, the ocean that Togo has always known is doing what oceans do, rising, slowly, patiently. Togo is paying attention. Morocco has long been a country that gathers itself toward its center, toward Rabat, toward Casablanca, toward the corridors where decisions get made. But there's a conversation building now, ahead of the 2026 legislative elections, about whether that old habit still fits. The phrase being used is territorial convergence, the idea that a country's regions shouldn't just receive policy from the capital, but should help shape it. That the distance between a village in the Atlas Mountains and a ministry in Rabat shouldn't also be a distance in dignity. It's not a dramatic story. There's no crisis driving it, no single moment to point to. It's more like a slow turning of attention, analysts and officials asking whether the architecture of government matches the lived geography of the country. Morocco's regions are deeply different from one another. The coast is not the interior, the south is not the north. And an election cycle, even one still a couple of years away, has a way of making those differences legible. What seems to be taking shape is less an argument than a quiet reckoning, a country asking how to hold itself together, not by pulling everything toward the middle, but by trusting what's already out at the edges. If you're still with me, it's worth sitting with that image for a moment. A map being redrawn, not in borders, but in attention. Peru sits on the western edge of South America, pressed against the Pacific, where the ocean floor slides beneath the continent. It is a place that knows earthquakes the way a coastal town knows tides, not because anyone gets used to them, but because they are part of the geography. This week, a 6.7 magnitude tremor struck the southern part of the country, strong enough to crack walls and buckle roofs. Homes were damaged, schools too. The full picture is still taking shape, as it always does after the ground moves, people checking on neighbors, counting what can be repaired and what cannot. Peru has lived through earthquakes far worse than this one, and that history is woven into how communities respond. There is a steadiness in it, a kind of practiced care. But steadiness does not mean it is easy. A damaged school means children waiting. A cracked home means a family sleeping somewhere else for a while. The details are still coming in, and I will not guess at them. What we know is that the earth shook hard in southern Peru, and people are sorting through what that means for them, quietly, carefully, the way you do when something large has passed through your life and left its mark. If you're still with me, we will carry on. Saudi Arabia has long been known to the world for what lies beneath its soil, the oil that shaped a century. But these days, something else is surfacing, something you can't pump or pipe. A French diplomat named Louis Blin has been watching a cultural shift take hold across the kingdom, and what he sees is a country reworking its own identity in full view of the rest of us. The details of his account are spare, but the direction is clear. Museums, festivals, heritage sites, film, the things a society builds when it begins to tell its own story in new ways. This isn't a small thing for a country whose image abroad has been narrow for so long. Culture, when it takes root, doesn't just decorate a nation. It changes how people see themselves and how others see them back. And in Saudi Arabia's case, that matters beyond its borders. The country has been busy on many fronts: diplomacy with Iraq, energy talks with neighbors, new coalitions forming across the region. But the cultural story may be the one that lasts longest, because it's the one that reaches people who never sit in a conference room. If you're still with me, consider this. A nation often spoken of in terms of power and oil is now also being spoken of in terms of what it creates, what it preserves, what it shares. And that, quietly, is a different kind of influence, one that settles in slowly, the way a good story does. Nepal has done something that, on paper, probably shouldn't have worked. Around the world, tiger and rhino populations have been falling for decades, squeezed by habitat loss and poaching. But in Nepal, the story has gone the other way. The country's conservation efforts have helped tiger and rhino numbers climb back, defying the global trend. It's the kind of success that doesn't come from a single dramatic gesture. It comes from years of patient work, much of it done by people whose names you won't find in the headlines. There are the rangers who walk the forests, the communities who live alongside these animals and have chosen to protect them, and the women whose everyday guardianship holds the whole thing together in ways that are easy to overlook. The Rana Tharu women of Nepal's lowlands have long played a quiet role in this, their knowledge of the land and its rhythms woven into the wider effort, and nearby farmers are finding that beekeeping can improve their livelihoods, building economic resilience that makes conservation easier to sustain. None of this is simple. Living near tigers and rhinos brings real challenges, and the balance between human needs and wildlife protection is never perfectly struck. But Nepal has shown that it can be done, and that the doing is often unglamorous, local, and slow. If you're still with me, hold that thought for a moment. Somewhere in Nepal's forests tonight, a tiger is moving through the tall grass, and it's there because people decided it should be. North Macedonia shares one of the oldest lakes in Europe with its neighbor Albania, and these days that lake is being asked to wait a little longer for rescue. Lake Ohrid sits in the mountains of the Balkans, so old that scientists sometimes call it a living museum of freshwater life, species found nowhere else. Water so clear you can read the stones beneath it. It has carried that distinction for decades, recognized by UNESCO as a place the whole world holds in trust. But trust, it turns out, needs tending. UNESCO has given both countries 5 years to bring unchecked construction around the lake under control. The shoreline has been changing, buildings going up faster than rules can keep pace with, the kind of pressure a quiet place absorbs until it can't anymore. 5 years sounds like a long time, and it also sounds like a clock. What happens next will depend on two governments moving together, which is never simple, and on the people who live along the water deciding what they want their shoreline to look like for the generations after them. If you've ever stood beside a lake that has been there since before history had a name, you know the particular stillness of it, the feeling that the water has seen everything and is in no hurry. Lake Ohrid has been patient for a very long time. Tonight it has 5 years, and the hope is that patience will be met with care. Panama has always been a place where the world's goods pass through a narrow opening. The canal that slices across its waistline is one of the busiest shortcuts on the planet, letting ships skip the long journey around South America. But these days, that shortcut is getting tighter. An El Niño drought has drained the freshwater lakes that feed the canal's locks, and the authority that runs it has started capping the number of ships allowed through each day. Fewer transits, longer waits. The water simply isn't there to lift the vessels the way it usually does, and when the line grows long enough, money starts talking. One ship recently paid $4 million to jump the queue, a staggering sum that tells you something about how much that passage is worth to global trade. Everything from consumer goods to grain to fuel moves through those locks, so a slowdown here ripples outward in quiet ways, eventually reaching shelves and prices far from Panama's shores. It is a strange thing to think about, a country holding the hinge of global commerce in its hands, and that hinge now loosened by weather. The canal has weathered droughts before and adapted. It will again. But for now, the gates open a little less often, and the ships wait a little longer on the water, resting at anchor under the same sky that holds back the rain. Slovakia has been taking a careful look at something most of us drive past without a second thought. It's traffic cameras. Across the country, 279 new cameras were installed as part of a rollout funded by the European Union. They were meant to watch the roads. But someone watching more closely discovered that the cameras had been watching back in ways no one intended. Hidden inside each one was a kind of back door, a quiet pathway that could let an outsider in. The access was surprisingly simple. A text message of all things could trigger it. And the live feeds from these cameras, the ones pointed at intersections and crosswalks, could be viewed without a password at all. The trail led back to Russia. Now there's no sign that anyone was harmed, and that matters. But the scale is what gives you pause. 279 cameras spread across Slovak roads, each one quietly connected to something it shouldn't have been. It's the kind of story that sits uneasily between the ordinary and the unsettling. These are everyday objects after all. We trust them to catch speeders and keep intersections safe. We don't imagine them as open windows. Slovakia is now left with the work of pulling them out, figuring out what was seen, and making sure the next batch is built differently. It's a quiet reminder that the things we install to watch over us can sometimes be watched over by someone else entirely. And perhaps, if you're still with me, that's worth sitting with for a moment before sleep. St. Lucia, that small green jewel of the Caribbean, has long been known for the way its mountains rise straight out of the sea. The pitons, those twin volcanic spires standing like sentinels off the southern coast. But these days, there's something new taking shape beneath the water nearby. St. Lucia is preparing to unveil its first national underwater sculpture park, an exhibition placed on the seabed where art and ocean meet. The details are still coming together, but the idea itself is a quiet kind of wonder. Sculptures lowered into clear Caribbean water, settled among the coral, meant to be visited by diverse and snorkelers and, over time, to become part of the reef itself. You can imagine how it might look. Figures standing on the seafloor, slowly being claimed by sponges and soft coral, fish weaving between them. In other parts of the world, Grenada, the Canary Islands, underwater sculpture parks have become both galleries and growing habitats, artificial reefs that draw sea life and visitors in equal measure. Now St. Lucia will have its own. It's the sort of project that doesn't shout. It asks you to slow down, put on a mask, and look carefully. And it speaks to something particular about an island nation, that its relationship with the sea isn't just about the shoreline, but about everything below the surface too. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. Still water, clear light coming down through it, shapes on the sand beginning their long, slow transformation. A breath of a story from St. Lucia tonight. Portugal has enacted a law that largely prohibits face coverings in public. It is being called the burqa law in headlines, though its reach is broader than any single garment or faith. The measure joins a wider conversation across Europe about where the line falls between individual freedom and public life, a conversation that has played out differently in each country that has taken it up. Portugal, a small nation on the Atlantic edge of the continent, with a long history of seafaring and cultural exchange, has often approached such questions with a quieter touch than some of its neighbors. The details of enforcement, of exemptions, of how the law will be felt on ordinary streets remain to be seen in the weeks ahead. What is clear is that something has shifted in the legal landscape. A country that prides itself on openness has chosen to set a boundary, however narrowly drawn. There will be those who welcome it as a matter of security and civic transparency, and those who feel it presses against a fragile kind of liberty. If you are still with me, you might sit with that tension for a moment, the way a democracy always holds two things at once. The night in Lisbon is settling over the old tiled facades and the river, and this new law is now part of the air there, quiet but present, waiting to be understood. Singapore sits close to the equator, and the heat there doesn't really arrive, it just stays. It's one of Asia's hottest cities, and for years now, the country has treated its trees as something more than decoration. Research is bearing that out. Street shade from canopy trees can measurably cool the air around roads. Tree cover near buildings can reduce the demand for air conditioning, which in a place where whole neighborhoods run their units nearly year-round is no small thing. There's a kind of patience in this approach. You plant a tree not because it fixes everything today, but because in 5 years, in 10, the street below it becomes a different place to walk. The shade becomes part of the architecture, not built, but grown. And in a dense city where every square meter is contested, choosing to keep space for living canopy is its own quiet statement about what matters. If you've ever walked under a line of rain trees in Singapore in the early afternoon, you'll know the difference. The air changes. The light softens. It's not dramatic, but it's real, and the research says so plainly. The trees are working even when no one is watching. And tonight that feels like a good thing to carry, the idea that some of the most useful things a city can do happen slowly, quietly overhead, one canopy at a time. In the Netherlands, hockey is one of those sports that sits close to the national heartbeat. Not loud about it, just steady. The way a river is steady. and so when the Dutch national side took the field in the FIH Hockey World Cup, there was a particular kind of quiet confidence in the air, the kind that doesn't need announcing. They faced India, a team with its own deep hockey traditions, and the match settled into something taut and measured. The Netherlands found their rhythm, pressing forward with patience, and the goals came, 3 of them, each one a small statement of control and craft. India pulled one back, a flicker of resistance, but it wasn't quite enough. The match ended 3-1. For the Dutch, it was a result that confirmed what their play had been suggesting: composure, structure, a sense that they know exactly who they are on this stage. For India, the loss left their semi-final hopes hanging by a thread, a difficult evening made harder by the clarity of the opposition. But that's the nature of this tournament, and of this sport. Margins are thin, and one match can quietly redirect the whole path ahead. The Netherlands moves on, steady as ever, with the sort of calm that comes from doing the work and trusting it. And if you're still with me, there's something fitting about that. A team that doesn't need to shout, just plays, and lets the result speak softly for itself. Oman has spent decades earning a reputation as the quiet mediator of the Gulf, the country that keeps channels open when others go silent. These days, that role has put it in a difficult and dangerous light. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow stretch of water between Oman and Iran, through which a vast share of the world's oil passes, has become the center of a confrontation Oman never sought. A former American president has spoken of bombing Oman if it, in his words, gets in the way of a conflict with Iran. The threat has echoed across dozens of news outlets, and it has left many Omanis grappling with a strange reversal. A country once called an indispensable ally, now spoken of as a target. Oman's foreign ministry has not answered with noise. That is not really the Omani way, but the weight of the words is felt. Ships have been observed moving along new routes near the Omani coast, a sign that the water itself is shifting under the strain. And still life continues in its own rhythm. Inflation has ticked upward. A South Korean firm has won a major contract to build a power plant. Scientists have identified 7 mushroom species previously unknown to science, growing quietly in corners of the landscape no one had looked at closely before. It is a reminder that a country is never only the story the world tells about it. Oman is the strait, the diplomacy, the worry. It is also the soil, the tide, the small discoveries. If you're still with me, hold all of that together for a moment, the way Oman itself does, steadily through nights like this one. Iraq has been looking ahead to the end of September and calling it something more than a date on a calendar. The government in Baghdad has described the withdrawal of the international coalition set for September the 30th as a historic transformation. It's a phrase that carries a particular weight in a country where foreign military presence has shaped daily life for more than 2 decades. The coalition, led by the United States, was formed to fight the Islamic State group, and its mission has been winding down for some time. Now, Iraq is preparing to take full responsibility for its own security, and officials are framing that transition not as a loss or a retreat, but as a kind of arrival. There's also movement nearby that matters to ordinary Iraqis. Iran has granted permission for a number of Iraqi oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, which matters deeply for a country whose economy depends so heavily on oil reaching world markets. These are not dramatic turns, no explosions, no sudden reversals. They are quieter shifts, the kind that reshape a country over years rather than days. And in Baghdad, and in Basra, and in the towns along the rivers, people will measure what historic transformation really means, not in headlines, but in the ordinary rhythms that follow. Whether the streets feel safer, whether the lights stay on, whether the future begins to look like their own. Indonesia sits at the center of a conversation that stretches across some of the busiest waters on Earth. This week, Indonesian and Chinese officials have been discussing how to deepen their cooperation on defense and on energy security. The details remain limited, but the direction is clear enough. Two large nations, neighbors in everything but a shared land border, are looking for ways to work more closely together. For Indonesia, energy security is not an abstract phrase. It is the question of whether the lights stay on, whether fuel reaches the outer islands, whether a nation of more than 17,000 islands can keep itself running. And defense, for a country that sits between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, is really about protecting that same quiet continuity. What makes these talks interesting is their tone. There is no grand announcement, no sweeping alliance being declared, just two governments sitting down and comparing notes on things that matter to daily life. China brings investment and infrastructure. Indonesia brings its growing regional voice and its own sense of what stability should look like in Southeast Asia. If you're still with me, you might notice how often the important stories are the quiet ones. Not the headlines that shout, but the meetings that simply happen steadily between countries that have decided talking is better than not talking. And in the warm air over the archipelago, that feels like a reasonable place to be. Suriname sits on the north coast of South America, small and quiet, often overlooked between its larger neighbors. These days, there's a modest note of encouragement from the Inter-American Development Bank, which sees a favorable medium-term economic outlook for the country. Not a boom, not a headline, but something steadier, the kind of forecast that lets a place plan a little further ahead than it could last year. The details are thin, but the direction matters. For a nation that has weathered debt restructuring and difficult reforms, a patient vote of confidence from outside lenders is not nothing. Meanwhile, a different kind of investment was made in memory. The Dutch central bank gave 500,000 euros to a museum honoring a pioneering Surinamese entrepreneur, someone whose name and story we don't have in full, but whose legacy clearly crossed the ocean and came back. There's something fitting about that. A financial institution in the former colonial power, recognizing a business life built in Suriname. It suggests that the story of enterprise in this part of the world is older and richer than the current economic charts. And maybe that's the quieter truth beneath the favorable outlook. Economies rise and settle, but the people who built things first, who took risks before the forecasts were kind, they're the ones worth remembering when the tide turns. If you're still with me, hold that thought. A small country, a gentle forecast, and a museum that keeps a name alive. That's Suriname tonight. Madagascar has always done things its own way, an island that drifted off on its own millions of years ago and never quite came back. And somewhere in its interior, there is a forest where no tree grows. They call it a forest of stone. The rock rises in tall, narrow shapes, gray and pale, standing close together the way real trees might in a dense wood. You can walk between them, but only just. Some are sharp-edged, some worn smooth by rain and wind, and the light that reaches the ground is thin and filtered, the way it is under a canopy. It is quiet there. Not empty. There are plants that have found a way to live in the cracks, and creatures that have learned to move through the stone without being cut by it, but quiet in the way a cathedral is quiet, the kind of place that reminds you the earth has been making things for far longer than we have been naming them. Madagascar is used to being extraordinary. It has forests of wood, too, and animals that exist nowhere else on the planet. But this is something different. This is the ground itself turned into something that looks almost alive. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment, standing in a forest where every trunk is stone and the silence is the loudest thing. It's enough to carry into the night. Canada finds itself in a familiar kind of standoff these days. Only the scale has grown. trade talks between Ottawa and Washington have collapsed, and the United States is set to impose tariffs of 50% on Canadian goods. That is a striking number between two countries whose economies have been tangled together for over a century, whose factories and farms and lumber mills have long operated as though the border were a doorway rather than a wall. Canada's response has been measured but firm. Prime Minister Mark Carney called the American move a miscalculation, and Ottawa has announced retaliatory tariffs of its own, set to begin in early September, matched dollar for dollar. The details of what went wrong are still emerging, but the broad shape is clear. Negotiators exchanged offers, neither side could agree, and within a span of about 72 hours, the whole arrangement fell apart. For people on the Canadian side, this is not abstract. It touches the lumber and steel and agricultural communities that stretch from British Columbia to the Maritimes, places where trade with the United States is not a policy debate but a daily livelihood. There is frustration in Carney's words, but also a steadiness, a sense that Canada will not simply absorb the pressure and wait. And so the two countries move closer to something neither has wanted in full, a trade war that will be felt in prices and paychecks, in the quiet choices families make at the store. It is the kind of story that unfolds slowly, in increments, and tonight Canada is watching it unfold with a calm, watchful eye. Luxembourg has a fair that's been turning up every late summer for more than 400 years, and this week the Schuberfuhr opened its gates once more. It's held on the Glacis Field, just outside the old city walls of Luxembourg City. And if you've never been, imagine a sprawling fairground of rides and food stalls and candy stands that takes over a whole neighborhood for nearly a month. There are Ferris wheels and bumper cars and the kind of churro stands that smell better than they have any right to. Photographs from opening day show families pushing strollers past flashing lights, teenagers leaning over railings, old friends sitting at long wooden tables with paper cones of Gromperkie, that's the Luxembourgish fried potato cake, a fairground staple. The Schuberfuhr dates back to 1340, when Count John the Blind granted it as a market fair, and somehow it has kept going through centuries of change, through wars and occupations, and the slow transformation of Luxembourg from a rural duchy into one of Europe's wealthiest corners. What's lovely is that the tradition traveled too. Across the Atlantic, America's Luxembourg community, descendants of 19th century immigrants, still holds its own version of the Schuberfuhr, keeping the name and the spirit alive in small towns where Luxembourgish once faded but never quite disappeared. So this week on the Glacis, the lights are on again. Children are dragging their parents toward the tallest ride. The air smells of sugar and diesel and frying dough, and a very old country is doing a very old thing, one more time. Malawi sits in the warm heart of southeastern Africa, and these days people there are thinking carefully about how the pieces of a food system fit together. The Stockholm Environment Institute has been looking at something it calls SDG synergies, the idea that when you improve one part of a country's food chain, the benefits can ripple outward into other goals, like clean water, decent work, or better health. It is a quiet kind of thinking, not the sort that makes headlines, but it matters deeply in a country where most people's lives are tied to the land. Malawi has known long seasons of hunger, and it has known the stubborn complexity of trying to feed a growing population from soil that does not always cooperate. So the question being asked is less about any single crop and more about alignment, how a change here might quietly support a change there, how roads and markets and rainfall and nutrition all lean on one another. There was also word this week of a youth summit showcasing soybean business opportunities for young Malawians, which fits the same pattern. Small seeds of possibility, planted with patience. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. Not a grand transformation announced from a podium, but a slow turning of attention toward how things connect. In Malawi, that turning is underway, steady and deliberate, carried forward by people who understand that the hardest work is often the work of seeing the whole picture. In Grenada, the island they call Spice Isle, Carnival is the season when everything loosens, when calypso and soca pour from every corner and the streets fill with paint and feathers and sweat and joy. But a reflection making the rounds this week asks a quieter question: what happens when the music stops? The headline calls it a never-ending nightmare. And though the full piece isn't before us, the sentiment is one anyone who has lived through a festival season might recognize. There's a particular kind of silence that follows the last band rolling off the road, the last truck packed away, the last speaker gone quiet. For some, it is simple tiredness. For others, it is something heavier, a reckoning with what remains once the celebration has moved on. Grenada's carnival, like so much in the Caribbean, is not just a party. It is a living tradition, carried by ordinary people who spend months preparing costumes and practicing music, often at their own expense. And when it ends, those same people return to the same lives, the same worries, the same tight budgets. The reflection seems to sit with that gap between the brilliance of the season and the plainness of what comes after. It is not a complaint so much as an honest accounting. And on a warm night in the southern Caribbean, that honesty feels worth holding on to, the understanding that joy is real, and so is what follows it. Sudan has begun forming a committee to plan the revival of Khartoum's war-damaged industrial zones. It's a small sentence to carry, but it holds a great deal. Khartoum, the capital at the meeting of the Blue and White Nile, was once the country's manufacturing heart, workshops and factories and small businesses that gave the city its working rhythm. The fighting that has swept through Sudan over recent months and years left many of those zones broken, their walls scarred, their machines silent. And so the news that officials are now organizing a committee to assess the damage and chart a path back is, in its quiet way, a gesture toward ordinary life returning. It's not a declaration of victory or a promise that things will be quick. It's something more modest, people sitting down together to ask what can be salvaged, what must be rebuilt from nothing, and where to begin. If you're still with me, you'll know that Sudan's story these days is heavy in many directions. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced in Kordofan. Farms along the Nile lie dry. Aid routes are uncertain. The weight of all of that is real, and it sits alongside this news rather than behind it. But a committee forming to rebuild factories is still worth noticing. It says that somewhere, even now, someone is thinking about the day after. And that kind of thinking, slow and unglamorous as it is, has a dignity of its own. Tonight, that's the story from Sudan. Kuwait sits at the northern edge of the Arabian Gulf, a small country that has long carried a quiet strategic weight. This week, it hosted the 16th meeting of the U.S.-Kuwait Joint Military Commission, a regular gathering where officials from both countries review their cooperation and look ahead. The commission meets annually, and its very steadiness is part of the story. These are conversations that have been going on for years through changing administrations and shifting regional currents, and they continue in the same measured tone. Kuwait and the United States have a defense relationship that stretches back decades, rooted in the aftermath of the Gulf War and maintained through joint exercises, logistics agreements, and a sustained American military presence on Kuwaiti soil. The readout from this year's meeting describes a review of joint cooperation, which is the language of two partners taking stock. It is worth noting that these talks come at a time of real regional tension. Iran has targeted sites in Bahrain and Kuwait in recent weeks, following American strikes elsewhere. 6 American troops were killed in Kuwait, the Pentagon has confirmed, so the commission met against a backdrop that is not abstract, and yet the meeting itself was routine, in the way that matters. It was planned, it was held, and the work of maintaining a long partnership continued. If you are still with me, consider that sometimes the most significant thing is not the dramatic event, but the steady conversation that follows it. Kuwait knows this well. Lebanon sits tonight between two pressures that have long shaped its life: the wish to govern itself freely and the reality of armed groups that answer to no government. The story worth carrying is a familiar one to anyone who knows this small Mediterranean country, but it has grown heavier these days. Efforts by Lebanon's own institutions to bring Hezbollah under state control, to fold its strength into the army and the political process the way a settled nation does, have stalled. And the reason is the war next door, the fighting with Israel that has pressed close against Lebanon's southern border and made every question about disarmament feel urgent and impossible at once. There was a time, not long ago, when people in Beirut talked about this more openly, about what it would mean for Lebanon to speak with one voice, to hold one gun, to be answerable to its own people and no one else. That conversation hasn't ended, but it has gone quiet, the way conversations do when survival moves to the front of the mind. And so the country waits, carrying its old complexity into another uncertain season, hoping that the noise across the border will settle enough for the harder, slower work of building a state to begin again. In Palestine, where the land itself has become a matter of daily argument, a quiet appeal has traveled from retired offices in Paris and London. More than 100 former French and British diplomats have signed an open letter calling on their governments to impose sanctions on Israel. They describe what they see as the erasure of Palestine, a word they chose carefully, knowing its weight. The letter, carried by Le Monde, asks France and the United Kingdom to act together, to uphold international law, not as a phrase repeated in speeches, but as something enforced. These are people who spent their careers inside the machinery of negotiation. They know how slowly that machinery turns, and still, they chose to speak, not privately, not through channels, but openly by name. 102 signatures. Ambassadors, consuls, advisors. People who once sat across tables from the very governments they are now pressing. Palestine has heard many appeals over the years, from many directions. Whether this one changes anything is not yet knowable. But there is something in the gesture itself. Former officials stepping out of retirement to say that what they see happening cannot be met with silence. If you are still with me, hold that for a moment. Not the politics of it, the stubbornness of conscience, arriving late perhaps, but arriving. In Honduras these days, there's a quiet conversation happening in towns and households across the country about who might be coming home. For years, many Hondurans have lived and worked in the United States under a designation called Temporary Protected Status, a legal arrangement that allowed people from countries affected by disasters or instability to remain and build lives far from those hardships. That protection is ending, and with it comes the likelihood that significant numbers of people will return to a country some left long ago, and some younger ones may barely know. There's concern woven through the conversation about jobs, about housing, about whether communities can absorb the arrivals with the dignity they deserve. And Honduras isn't alone in this. Reports indicate that more than 2,300 Mexican nationals have been sent to Guatemala and Honduras under expanded third country deportation arrangements, adding another layer to an already complicated picture. What stays with me is the human dimension beneath the policy language. These are people who've built routines, raised children, paid rent in someone else's city. Now they're facing the question of what home means when you've been away long enough for it to change without you. Honduras has weathered difficult chapters before, and its communities have shown a stubborn capacity for holding together. If you're still with me, hold that thought, the resilience of ordinary people finding their footing in a place they thought they'd left behind. It's a story still being written, and it deserves our attention as it unfolds. Colombia has been pulling itself back together after an earthquake that ruptured both the ground and the country's sense of steadiness. The shaking has stopped, but the work of mending what it broke is still very much ongoing. Senators have been moving through affected areas, assessing the recovery, Not just the physical damage, but whether the response is reaching the people who need it most. It is the kind of slow, unglamorous work that rarely makes headlines but determines how a country heals. Aid has come from many directions. The Red Cross has maintained its presence on the ground. Doctors Without Borders has been there too, attending to the medical needs that follow any disaster when infrastructure gives way. American military aircraft, including C-17 cargo planes, have carried supplies into the country, a quiet bridge between nations when the need is urgent. UNICEF has put out an appeal focused on the children because children always bear disasters differently than adults do, and their recovery takes longer. And Colombia's own artists have stepped forward. Musicians like Karol G and Maluma have used their platforms to rally support, turning concert stages into channels for relief. Meanwhile, the political fractures the earthquake exposed have not healed on their own. Senator De La Espriella faces the task of rebuilding not only what the earth broke, but what politics had already strained. It is a dual burden, the visible damage and the invisible one. If you are still with me, consider this. Recovery is never a single moment. It is a long, patient act of returning piece by piece. And that's the world for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow holds, rest easy. The world will keep turning slowly while you sleep, and we'll take another quiet trip around it tomorrow night. Good night.